At 22, Caleb had already learned that life did not always give you the respect you deserved. Every morning before sunrise, he woke up in a small rented apartment, put on his work uniform, packed a simple lunch, and headed to the office building where he worked as a janitor. It wasn't the job he had dreamed about, but it was honest work. Caleb cleaned offices, emptied trash cans, polished floors, fixed small problems, and made sure the building looked perfect before hundreds of employees arrived each morning. Most people barely noticed him. Some didn't even bother saying hello. But Caleb never complained. He had one goal: save enough money to build a better future. His father, however, saw things differently. His father, Richard, had always believed that success meant having an expensive car, a powerful job title, and people who looked up to you. Whenever relatives asked what Caleb was doing, Richard avoided giving a straight answer. His figuring things out, he would say. Caleb knew what that meant. His father was embarrassed by him. The worst moment came during Thanksgiving. The entire family gathered at Richard's large house. The dining table was covered with expensive food, candles, and beautiful decorations. Caleb arrived quietly and took his seat near the end of the table. Everyone was talking about their careers. One cousin had become a lawyer. Another had started working for a technology company. Then Richard raised his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he announced. Everyone became quiet. Richard smiled and looked around the table. To the kids who actually made something of themselves. People laughed softly. Then Richard looked directly at Caleb. "Unlike some people," he added, "who spend their days cleaning toilets." The laughter became louder. Caleb felt his face become hot. His mother looked uncomfortable, but she said nothing. Richard continued, 22 years old and still a janitor. What happened to all those big dreams you had?" Caleb stared at his plate. For a moment he wanted to defend himself. He wanted to tell everyone how hard he worked, how he had been studying business at night, how he had been saving every dollar, how he had already started learning about real estate. But instead he simply stood up. "I hope everyone has a good Thanksgiving." Then he walked out. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He didn't cry in front of them. He simply made a decision. That night, Caleb promised himself that he would never again allow someone else's opinion to decide his worth. From that day forward, he worked harder. During the day, he cleaned buildings. At night, he studied real estate, business, finance, and investing. He watched lectures, read books, studied property prices, saved money. And whenever he felt tired, he remembered his father's words. Not because he wanted revenge, because he wanted to prove to himself that his life could become something greater. 5 years passed. Caleb bought his first small property. It was old and needed serious repairs. People told him he was making a mistake, but Caleb saw potential. He renovated it, rented it out, and reinvested the profits. Then he bought another, and another. Slowly, his small business grew. Caleb went from owning one property to several. Eventually, he opened a real estate company. He hired employees. He bought office buildings. He even started helping young people find affordable housing. Yet he never forgot where he came from. He still remembered the days when he had cleaned bathrooms while dreaming about becoming successful. Then one afternoon, something happened that Caleb never expected. He was sitting in his office reviewing documents when his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Caleb, there's a man outside asking to see you." "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "Your father?" Caleb looked up from his desk. For several seconds he couldn't speak. His father had not called him in months. "What does he want?" The assistant lowered his voice. "He says he needs a job." Caleb leaned back in his chair. The man who once laughed at him for cleaning toilets was now sitting outside his office asking for work. For the first time, Caleb realized that life had brought the story full circle. He took a deep breath. "Send him in." The door opened. Richard walked inside. But he didn't look like the confident man Caleb remembered. His expensive clothes were gone. His shoulders were lowered. His face looked tired. He stood silently in front of Caleb's desk. "Hello, son." Caleb looked at him. "Hello, Dad." Richard swallowed. "I need your help." Caleb said nothing. Richard continued. "I lost my business." The room became silent. "I made some bad decisions." Richard admitted, "I lost almost everything." Caleb watched him carefully. Then Richard said the words Caleb never expected to hear. "I heard your company was hiring." Caleb slowly stood from his chair. "Yes, we are." Richard looked at him. "Could you give me a job?" Caleb remembered Thanksgiving. He remembered the laughter. He remembered his father's toast. But he also remembered the promise he had made to himself. He wasn't going to become cruel just because someone had once been cruel to him. Caleb looked at his father and said, "Sit down, let's talk." And for the first time in many years, Richard sat across from his son, not as a successful father speaking to a disappointing child, but as a man asking his son for a second chance. Richard sat quietly across from Caleb. The silence between them felt heavier than any argument they had ever had. Caleb opened a folder. "We have several positions available," he said, "but I need to understand something first." Richard nodded. "What happened to your company?" Richard looked down. "I thought money made me powerful." He took a deep breath. "I borrowed too much, invested in the wrong projects, trusted the wrong people. When everything started falling apart, the people I thought were my friends disappeared." Caleb listened without interrupting. Richard's voice became quieter. "Eventually I lost my house." Caleb's expression softened, but he remained calm. "And your family?" Richard looked at him. "Your mother left me." For the first time, Caleb saw something he had never seen in his father before. Regret. "I treated people badly," Richard said. "Especially you?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. Richard continued. "That Thanksgiving, I was cruel." "You were," Caleb replied. Richard nodded. "I know." He looked around Caleb's beautiful office. "I thought being a janitor made you a failure." Caleb smiled faintly. "But it was that job that taught me discipline." Richard lowered his eyes. "I understand that now." Caleb closed the folder. "I can give you a job." Richard looked surprised. "You can?" "Yes." Richard's eyes became emotional. "But it won't be an executive position." "I don't expect one." "You'll start as a property maintenance coordinator." Richard nodded. "I'll do it. There will be no special treatment because you're my father." "I understand. And you'll have to respect every employee here." Richard looked directly at him. "I will." Caleb stood and extended his hand. Richard stared at it for a moment before taking it. Their handshake was simple, but it represented years of pain, regret, and forgiveness. Richard started working the following Monday. The first few weeks were difficult. He struggled with the computer system. He didn't understand some of the procedures. He even made mistakes, but Caleb never humiliated him. Instead, he trained him. One afternoon, Richard saw Caleb speaking with a young janitor in the hallway. The employee had made a mistake and looked terrified. Caleb smiled and said, "Don't worry. Everyone makes mistakes. Learn from it and keep going." Richard watched silently. Those words stayed with him. That evening he approached Caleb. "You know something?" "What I used to think success meant having people serve you." Caleb smiled. "And now I think success means being someone others can trust." Caleb nodded. "I think you're finally understanding." Months passed. Richard became one of Caleb's most reliable employees. He arrived early. He stayed late. He treated everyone with respect. And slowly the relationship between father and son began to change. They started having lunch together. They talked about business. They talked about family. Sometimes they even laughed about old memories. One evening, Richard asked Caleb something that had been troubling him. "Do you hate me?" Caleb was silent for a moment. "No." Richard looked surprised. "After everything I said?" Caleb nodded. "I used to be angry. Then what changed?" Caleb looked out through the office window. "I realized that if I spent my whole life trying to punish you, you'd still control my life." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," Caleb said, "but I deserve peace." Richard looked away. That was the moment he finally cried. Not because he had lost his money, not because he had lost his business, but because he realized how close he had come to losing his son forever. Years later, Caleb became one of the most respected business owners in his city, but he never forgot the job that started everything. Whenever someone asked him about his success, he always gave the same answer. "I started by cleaning floors." People sometimes laughed when they heard it. Caleb never did, because he knew something they didn't. There is no shame in honest work. The shame is believing that another human being is beneath you because of the work they do. And every Thanksgiving after that, Caleb invited his employees to his home. He made one rule. Everyone sat at the same table. Managers, cleaners, maintenance workers, executives, everyone. One Thanksgiving. Caleb stood up and raised his glass. Richard was sitting beside him. Caleb smiled and said, "To everyone who works hard even when nobody notices." The room became quiet. Then Richard stood. He raised his glass and added, "And to the people we once underestimated." Caleb looked at his father. They smiled at each other. There was no anger anymore, only understanding. Caleb had finally realized that success wasn't about making his father regret what he had done. It wasn't about proving everyone wrong. His greatest victory was becoming the kind of man who could rise above humiliation. Without becoming cruel, he had started as a young janitor whom his own father was ashamed of. He became a successful businessman, but more importantly, he became a better human being. And that was something no amount of money could ever buy.